Hi everyone, this is Lindsay Hooper with a quick producer's note for all of our listeners. More than a refresh and the broader command prompt team value the freedom to work from anywhere at any time. For our podcast host JD, that means embarking on a cross-country road trip with his family and dogs. As such, this episode is recorded outdoors in the beautiful Fort Missoula Regional Park in Montana, so you may hear some background noise. Enjoy the podcast, and we hope you get to go outside today too.
Welcome to More Than a Refresh, a podcast about data and the people who wrangle it. Our guest today is Jim Muljenski of AWS. Jim, introduce yourself.
Hi, JD. I'm Jim Muljenski. I'm one of the co-chairs with Conference with you and Amanda. I am also one of the organizers of the Philly Postgres meetup, New York Postgres meetup, longtime Postgres user. And for a day job, I work at AWS and RDS for Postgres.
So, before we get into our day job stuff, let's talk a little bit about your background because I think a lot of people, especially in the community, the open source community and the Postgres community, especially, backgrounds are odd because we'll all know each other. For example, myself through command prompt, yourself through your various interests. Um, but the community itself may not know our actual backgrounds beyond Postgres or something like that. Where are you based?
I am based in Florida, U.S. A recent Floridian, right? A transfer from New Jersey. So my wife and I are in the process of moving and becoming full-time residents here in Florida after being lifelong Jersey people.
So that's interesting to me because the culture between Jersey and New York and that area is quite a bit different than what I would expect from Florida. I mean, obviously Jersey and New York are blue states, Florida's red state, and culturally that's different. But more importantly, I would think fiscally it probably made sense, didn't it?
Yeah, New Jersey, other than California, has kind of the highest cost of living in the country. But we really made the move more for we just like it there. I grew up at Jersey Shore, so wasn't anywhere near New York. I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, and when I was there as a kid, it was dirt roads. So it wasn't really the big hubbub of the New York metropolitan area that I really grew up with. I just liked going to the beach, water sports, and Florida gives us the opportunity to do that all year long, right? And you move down to a small town in Florida, not a big city like Tampa or Miami. We like the small town feel of just being near the beach and being able to do the things we love all the time now that our son's in college.
Well, I certainly appreciate that small town feel. I mean, as you know, I'm living out in the county of where Bellingham is, which is not that big of a town in itself. But I must say, I've been to Jersey a lot, and for their taxation rates, you'd think that the roads that they have are still dirt roads.
Yeah, especially New Jersey is right along that frost line, which is another reason why we're moving of getting away from the snow. But we're not like upstate New York where it freezes and stays frozen all year long. New Jersey, it uh, it gets frozen during the night and it thaws during the afternoon. So you get potholes up the wazoo in Jersey. So it's a
Yeah,
struggle to keep those roads in good shape.
yeah, and to be fair, I mean that is any kind of situation where you're having extreme climate change within a 24-hour period on an often basis. That's going to be difficult on any kind of infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's just physics, right? It's just the way it works. So, you know, everyone talks about the pandemic, and we don't need to get into that a lot because we've all been living it. We all know where we're at with it. But I am curious, did it really change the way you work over like 18 months? I mean, how has your
Yeah,
life changed since the pandemic has come about?
yeah. For me personally, it was a pretty dramatic change. Even even though I've always kind of worked from home, my normal operating way of doing things is traveling to see customers, to see people I work with, where I would normally travel half the time out of the year. And that all stopped with the pandemic. So I've always found it more effective to meet people face to face and work through problems with them face to face and get to know people on a more personal level than just through Zoom calls. And that all changed with the pandemic, of not being able to travel and go see people and get to know people more than just in meetings that you see them you know throughout the day.
So that's interesting because for me, I mean, as you know, I only traveled for business, essentially for the conferences,
Yeah.
right? All my other travel was for leisure and pleasure. And the only thing that really changed for me is instead of flying places, we drove places. Um, and one of the things I always found interesting, and this is just speaking to differences in people, when I would go speak in Europe, in whether it be Ireland or Paris or whatever, for the community, they would always be confused that I wouldn't hang out. And it was nothing against the people that were running the conferences. They're awesome people, but it's like I'm in Ireland. Why do I want to go sit in a bar? I want to go see thousand-year-old castles, right? That's what I want to go do. Or in Paris, and go see the Louvre and the Notre Dame and all those things. So for me, it didn't change much. For you, I mean, we've known each other a long time, and that's one of the things that I always remember is we would communicate. You'd be in one city or the next, and I would text you, and you'd be like, "I'm in Mumbai. Can I get back to you?"
Yep.
Um, and so I could imagine it was actually pretty drastic. I mean, since it's not like you've done this for 5 years, right? We're talking about decades.
Right. Well, yeah, that was, even a big interest in my more personal life of my family having me home all the time. Right? They're used to having a break from me every now and then, and it was just something that throughout my entire relationship with my wife, but we've always had a little bit of alone time. And the
So
pandemic kind of brought us all together. And it's been really good in the long run of being able to be home and spend more time with my family. But it was an adjustment over the first couple months.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where you're sitting across the table, and usually you get home on, say, Friday morning, and you're there for the weekend, and you guys have a great weekend. You go do things and work on the house or whatever, and you do normal domestic stuff, and then you go back to work, and that back to work maybe in the office for the day, and then you're gone for another week. But now you have to actually talk to each other and like each other.
Yeah, yeah, and with the pandemic, like everyone else, everybody's day is exactly the same, right? It's where what did you do today? That everybody knows what you did that day when you're talking with everybody in the same household, right? Yeah, I went up to the office and worked all day, and then I left. So it was an adjustment. I'm sure everybody has their own personal stories about like the way that it adjusted for everybody. But for me, the that lack of travel that I've done since my career started, right as a consultant way back when I was a young lad, um, it was just a big change.
Yeah, for us, I mean, what we've started doing, as you know, we have a schoolie, and we had one for 4 years, and then we upgraded to a new one this year, and we're on our inaugural trip in this schoolie. And right now we're in Missoula, Montana. I'm sitting at the Fort Missoula Regional Park, and it's weird here because I mean, obviously it's a school day, and Montana has their kids in school, and Montana can do that because they have like 6 people per mile. Right?
Yeah,
Even their big, I mean, their second largest city is Missoula, and it only has 75,000 people. So it's quite a bit different. But for us, that's kind of what happened is that since now we're not getting on planes, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to get on a plane again at this point. We've decided, since we've always been remote, like yourself, that we would just work from the bus. And so we're out for 3 months. I mean, we're doing a coast to coast, border to border.
Yeah,
But all that
yeah,
being
that
said, no,
yeah,
go ahead.
that kind of is really what drove some of the move to Florida. We always planned on doing that. It just kind of moved up the timeline a bit. We started traveling down there during the pandemic because it was one of the places that was open and we could go to, and it was drivable from New Jersey. So we started going down there, and we just said, "Why wait?" Right? So it's we just love it there, being near the water. So it, because of the pandemic and being trapped in the house all the day, it kind of sped up our plans of what we were going to do maybe 5 years from now. It convinced us to do it now.
Well, let's talk about being close to the water because we are talking about Florida. And I've been to Florida, and they have bugs that make Australia go, "Yep, nope, I'm out." So, what about gators?
Oh yeah, I, there's some in my backyard. It's fantastic. They're they're fascinating to watch. So long as you're careful and you pay attention when you're near the bodies of water, they're just part of life. Other parts of the country might have deer or bear or other things. It's just the natural wildlife is there, and that was frankly part of the draw is the wildlife that we were able to see in the town in Florida that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, everyone hears the stories every year about the person with less than average bar IQ trying to pet a bison. I mean, that's where I'm at, right? What you see here is bison, bear. Last year when we were here, we were driving down the road and had to stop because there was a huge bull elk right in the middle of the highway. I mean, he just stared at me. He's like, "I know you're in a bus, but I think I can take you." you know.
Right.
So we just waited for him to be done, whatever he was choosing to do.
Yep.
But let's get a little business on here. You're kind of a serial entrepreneur, but uh, not in the traditional sense. Not in the where you do a startup and do a startup and do a startup. You kind of more did a startup with someone and then a startup with someone and so on and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about your history there.
Right. So yeah, I followed around one friend, Dennis Lucier, since I graduated college. He hired me out of college and gave me my first opportunity. But he had a small consulting company. I was the fourth employee there. So I was always in small companies, and we 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 did that. And out of that company, we spun out Enterprise DB, where I was the chief architect for a while. So Dennis and I and several others from what was called Fusion Technologies at the time started up Enterprise DB, and we did that for a number of years until we learned the hard way of how venture capital works, right? And learned a lot along those lines, where a lot of us early people left in order to go do new venture. I went and did a startup where I wanted to do it on my own a little bit, a company called StormDB, early 2010s, where it was hosting Postgres in the cloud, right? But doing horizontally scalable Postgres. And it was really difficult to convince anybody that that was a good idea. So,
Well,
so
at the time, it was. I mean, that's early adopter, real early adopter type stuff right there.
yeah,
Let's go back to Enterprise DB a little bit though, because there's some interesting facts that I don't think that a lot of people know. And first, for our listeners who are not Postgres people, which is growing quite a bit because we talk a lot about data, and it's not always Postgres people that we have. The uh, Enterprise DB, well, first off, at one time was one of Command Prompt's customers,
yes, it was.
which is one of the things a lot of people find fascinating. And to this day, I will be honest, to this day, whenever someone calls me and says, "Hey, how are you different than Enterprise DB?" Besides the obvious that we don't do products, we're largely services. I'll say, "Well, Enterprise DB is a great company. They used to be one of my customers." Um, but some of the things that are interesting about Enterprise DB. You mentioned learning the ins and outs of venture capital, and I think that this would be interesting to some of our listeners because I know that a lot of them are in this realm where they have an interesting idea and they're trying really hard to make things better. Um, and I remember we were at one of the first Postgres conferences. I think it was in '09 in Seattle, and I was doing the intro, and I made an offhanded joke about basically overcapitalization and destroying the value of the shareholders stock. That is, um, and you were in the front row, and you were dying because it was just one of these obvious. It was an easy barb, it was an easy target, and it was absolutely true, right?
Absolutely.
And so, what would be your tip? As I'm going to walk by a big old golf cart here, folks.
Yep.
What is your number one tip to someone? We're getting old, so let's say they're 22, 23, 24, 25, and they've got the idea, and they've written the plan, and people are now talking to them. What would be your number one tip to those people to not get swallowed into the oblivion of what can be venture capital?
Venture capital isn't bad. It's just understanding that what the point is of the venture capitalists want to make money, and in doing that, they want to have more and more invested into you to be able to have a bigger share of the company. So they're going to offer more than you may potentially need. It's no different than when you're going for a mortgage when the bank says you qualify for a $10 billion mortgage, but you really you could only afford a $100,000 mortgage, right? It's they're going to try to give you the biggest possible option, and that's really the trap we fell into in the early days of Enterprise DB. So we had a fantastic idea of let's make Postgres Oracle compatible. So this way people can go ahead and migrate their applications that were on Oracle and move it over to Postgres and not have to make any changes to their application, right? It was a great story, and we had some really great early wins with customers with Sony Online Entertainment moving some of their online games over to uh, Enterprise DB and Postgres. And when the venture capitalists saw that, they said, "This is a fantastic opportunity." So they offered us more money, and us not knowing the ins and outs nearly as much, we said, "That's fantastic. We'll take the money." But in doing so, we gave up more and more control of the company. Um, so we kind of got out ahead of our skis a little bit. So we without completely proving out the business model, we took in more money um, before we knew we had a repeatable business model. The that first win with Sony Online Entertainment really wasn't the right way to grow the company. It wasn't. We saw reality if we looked at it in retrospect over a couple of years. We got a lot more smaller and mid-sized companies as their customers. That Sony deal was an enterprise, and that wasn't the typical customer. But we started building the company as if that was the model to grow. It wasn't until years later that Enterprise DB really got into the bigger enterprises and could reliably work with them. In those early days, we were just kind of clawing at whatever we could from a customer standpoint. So it's really to slow things down when we really want to be able to do things from a venture capital company. It's a great way to grow a company if you do it with your eyes wide open of what you're doing when you do it.
I think that you made a really interesting point because back then, I mean, for everyone's knowledge, we're talking about '04, '05, '06, '07, the early
Yep.
years. Postgres was not an enterprise database back then. It was working toward it. And it's not that it wasn't a good database. It was a great database. I've made my entire career, modern career, off of Postgres. But at that time, it really was for your online business. If it wasn't like eBay, right? It was for your departmental, services. I remember sitting down with Intel. They flew me down years and years and years ago, right around this time, and they're like, we'd like to use Postgres. What's it good for? And they were telling me the things they wanted to use it for. I'm like, guys, it's not there yet. It will be. In fact, why don't you donate some engineers to help make it that way? But it's not there yet. And I think that that's important for not just venture capital, but people deploying technology to recognize where a technology is good and where it's bad. I mean, every technology has good and bad points. I mean, the fact that we still have to vacuum, even though it's gotten much better and much more manageable over the years, that is definitely a drawback to the management of PostgreSQL is making sure that you keep all of the maintenance where it needs to be when you are on heavy 24/7 load. But nowadays, I mean, Postgres is an enterprise database, and outside of the most rare, and when I say rare, I mean, tell me if you disagree, but I would argue that Postgres can cover 95% of what's really out there for general purpose database needs. And then if you add certain extensions, certain time series extensions or GIS extensions, you can make it very specialized to service all of your needs. But I think it's fair to give Oracle its kudos in that, let's be honest, I mean, they have billions of dollars just to work on the planner, right? So they certainly have a leg up in certain instances, but not nearly as much as it used to be. What do you think?
Yeah, it more Postgres could handle anything that the relational model can, right? So it really, if you design your application for Postgres instead of making a migration, you're able to scale that to huge heights. I see that day to day working with customers today, and even Amazon made the big switch of moving from Oracle to Postgres, and migrated pretty much all of the databases off of Oracle over the last several years, handling the biggest workloads that are out there. It really just comes down to when the relational model breaks down, when you're willing to give up things like consistency in order to be able to get wider scale.
Right.
But Postgres can kind of do that, and I see it with customers all the time. Of the biggest workloads in the world, a lot of them are running on Postgres. You just don't know about it because there's no company behind Postgres that has to say, "Hey, we sold you a license. It's open source," so people could just leverage it and use it.
Agreed. And I want to put a pin in that because there's a couple things I want to explore. But let's go back to, we talked about Enterprise DB a little bit. They're still around. They're kind of a different company now, and we don't need to go into that. But as I understand, there's been like reverse merger type stuff. But I want to talk about StormDB because this is a common problem in the startup world. You have investors who have money literally to burn, and you have startups with a great idea, but the investors don't normally necessarily understand what you're doing, or maybe you're too early. And that's what I think happened with StormDB, is that you were one of the first to market in terms of horizontally scaling and hosting Postgres in a managed fashion. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So it was even before AWS was managing Postgres with RDS Postgres. We we had the idea of having managed Postgres. We even put in our own servers in the equivalent of a data center of where AWS was at the time down in Virginia. But a lot of it was how we were trying to raise money. It was in the early days. Everybody was at the time. We're never going to put our relational database in the cloud. That's our crown jewels. We're not gonna do that. And yeah, this was 2010, 2011, really early days of the cloud around databases. And we knew at the time that in order to be able to scale some of the bigger workloads, you needed to do horizontal scalability. So we leveraged the old project Postgres XC, and in turn built Postgres XL in order to make it even more scalable and easier to manage. And that's what we were hosting at the time. But we ran into two issues. One, that it was early on, and two was our geographic location. Myself and Mason Sharp, who was my co-founder, the two of us, we lived in New Jersey, and the venture capitalists in the New York, New Jersey area, they at the time they were all about apps. What app are you going to put on people's phones? What maybe it's in the pharma industry or financial services industry. They weren't about IT infrastructure, the way things were in the Bay Area. So we got some early interest around funding out of Bay Area venture capitalists. But one of the requirements was we'd have to move the company to California. And that wasn't something we wanted to do. So
Well, I'm
we,
right there with you, brother.
yeah, right. It's just, you know, you know, that's a big move, asking our families to move across the country for a startup that like that. So it wasn't something that we could really conceivably do.
So this is a really interesting point. There's a couple of companies that I once remember, or not once, I remember often think of that were in similar situations, not in terms of getting the interest in its venture capital, but being before their time. The first one I want to bring up is Great Bridge. Do you remember Great Bridge?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so for those who are listening, Great Bridge was the first go at a commercial Postgres company of consequence. And when I say consequence, they wanted to reach the enterprise. They wanted to do what Enterprise DB did. They want to do what Command Prompt does and has been doing since 1997. They really wanted to become the Red Hat of Postgres, which Red Hat also tried to do and failed. But the problem that they had, and it was interesting. This was in Command Prompt's early days with Postgres. We actually started with Postgres 95 before PostgreSQL existed. And we called them and said, look, we know Postgres in and out. We know what we're doing, but we'd like to have a tier 4 team because we know that you have the engineers working on the back end code itself.
Yeah.
And we might call you twice a year, maybe. And they wanted to charge, and it was just astounding to me. They said, well, that'll be at least $15,000.
Yep.
So the moral of this story is they wanted me to pay them $15,000 to call them maybe twice a year. They went out of business 9 months later. Command Prompt is still in business. And we do what we do today because of them. The decisions that they made led us down a path of success with Postgres, and a direct result of not doing it their way. But they were very much ahead of their time because at that time, when Great Bridge first came around, vacuum was still locking, for example.
Yep.
Right. So you couldn't run Postgres 24/7, period. And then the second company, and this is one that astounded me because this is a piece of software that every Ubuntu user, every Fedora user, every SUSE user, anybody running Linux with a GNOME or GNOME style desktop is using this piece of software. And yet they burned through $15 million and vaporized. Do you know what that software is?
I don't.
It's Nautilus.
Oh, I
So
remember them.
Nautilus is the file manager for GNOME. And Nautilus once was a company, and they raised $15 million. And why were they ahead of their time? Is that Nautilus was the original app store. Their goal was that you were going to be able to buy apps for Linux through Nautilus, and they would take a piece, just like Google, just like Apple, but they were way ahead of their time. And they just disappeared. And now our entire ecosystem, in one way or another, is driven by apps coming out of an app store.
Yeah, that's how people just consume things anymore, from your phones or even on people's newer desktops. They're
Well,
just down that way.
yeah. I mean, right now we're having this podcast, and I'm on my Android phone, and I'm using the Zoom app and our producer is on the Zoom app, Lindsay. Thank you for your wonderful work. And she's recording. We'll be editing this and cussing the whole time because the wind is going and you can hear babies crying in the background and there's sprinklers. But hey, that's life. So we just got to kind of deal with it. So you had some key learnings from StormDB. I remember you exiting StormDB. For full disclosure, I actually made a little money off of that exit because I was one of your initial seeded, or Command Prompt was one of your initial seed investors.
Yes, you were.
When you left EDB, we know you went to StormDB.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, let's move on. Let's move on from StormDB. Where did you go after StormDB?
After StormDB, I went back with my old friend Dennis Lazier, who had a company called OpenSCG. which stands for the Open Source Consulting Group, doing Postgres consulting. It's really a lot of the things that what Command Prompt did at the time, and does now. But we focus more on the app side compared to what Command Prompt did on the operation side, and really focused on migrations from Oracle to Postgres. We did that at Enterprise DB. We know that space really well.
Yeah, I mean, to use a trendy term, command prompt, frankly, I don't think it is we are the best Postgres DevOps team in North America. I used to try to, well, thank you. I used to try to be a little bit more humble about it, but all of my competition either went out of business or got bought. So I think that's probably a fair statement. And speaking of getting bought, OpenSCG would be the second time that Command Prompt has made money from a venture of yours modifying itself, and that was AWS purchasing OpenSCG, correct?
That's right. Yeah,
And,
that's how I came to AWS. Because we really focused on the migrations from Oracle to Postgres, and Amazon and AWS really focusing on database freedom of moving people off of the commercial databases onto open source databases. And at the time, doing an internal project of moving off all the internal Amazon databases from Oracle onto Postgres, it was just a perfect fit.
So that's a good point. Would it be accurate to say that you cannot purchase a product from Amazon.com without using Postgres?
That's true. Right? It is throughout the entire organization of using Postgres, right down to the fulfillment centers of when you have your package shipped, it's shipped using Postgres.
And would it also be an accurate statement to say that you cannot buy something from Amazon.com without using Linux?
That's true.
So the reason I say that, I say those very two specific things, is that even to this day, we run into companies that will say, you'll have someone sitting behind the other side of the desk, and they're like, why should I trust Postgres? Why should I trust Linux? First off, Postgres is the Linux of databases. It is everywhere. You are using it and you don't even know it. If you don't shop at Amazon, I'd be really surprised and maybe even call you a liar. Because everybody does at some point. I mean, maybe you make it a point to not shop at Amazon for your primary needs, but sometimes you need organic, bamboo, biodegradable, scented butt wipes. And the only place you can get them is Amazon. And the rose petal ones are awesome, man. I'm telling you, pick them up. That being said, you work primarily with RDS, yes?
That's right.
Well, what is your specific role with RDS? And for those that don't know RDS, I mean, a lot of people listening to this will know what RDS is, but RDS stands for Remote Database Service, and there are multiple versions. Relational Database Service, and there are multiple versions of it. There's a MySQL version for some unknown reason. The one that really matters, though, is the Postgres version, and that's the one you focus on, right?
Right. So I'm a principal database engineer in the RDS open source team. So I primarily focus on RDS Postgres, but I do work with RDS MySQL and RDS MariaDB.
Okay, we'll just pretend you didn't say it. We'll just pretend that didn't get said. Let's focus on the real products here.
They do have big use cases, and it is just like Postgres, people moving off those commercial databases onto open source databases. And AWS likes to give people choice about doing that. There's the people who are, in my opinion, the people who are really serious about their data is going to Postgres. But there is a lot of legacy MySQL out there. And there's still a lot of people who are moving to MariaDB. They have a great community and they're innovating and doing some really interesting things over there.
Now that I think is a fair statement. I'm not a MySQL fan. I never have been. From the beginning days, they've always done some things that were really weird to me. But I know a couple of the people that started MariaDB. They're good people. They are trying to put out a good product. They have a strong community, and they actually have uh, some interesting culture because their licensing is different. So I don't want to take away from that. Would you primarily say outside of commercial databases? I mean, MySQL is open source, but it's an open source product, right? It's not like MariaDB where there's a company behind it, but there's a lot of things going on there. Are the migrations primarily coming out of MySQL to MariaDB, or are you seeing like Microsoft SQL to MariaDB?
It's Microsoft SQL. I'm not seeing nearly as much of the MySQL to MariaDB that I would have expected, but I see a lot of new use cases with MariaDB. It's there, you know, people databases have a lot of inertia. So if you've been using it for a while, it's hard to change them. So people just
Well,
keep using the same thing and even the same versions, which is a problem for people where the versions deprecate.
And that is actually a common complaint from Amazon or customers of Amazon. For example, Postgres 9.6 going end of life,
Mhm.
Amazon forces the upgrade. Now, that can be frustrating, but let me be very clear to every single listener. You have to upgrade, and it's good that you do.
Yes, it
There's
does.
period. Okay. We take a lot of phone calls like, damn it, Amazon's making us upgrade. Will you support us? I'm like, yeah, we'll support you to upgrade. It's end of life. So the way command prompt does is we'll actually say, if you want us to continue to support 9.6, we will do so. But there's a 35% surcharge on our hourly rates and our support contracts. And it goes up every year that over the year of the end of life until they upgrade as an incentive to get them to upgrade. Now, I absolutely understand the argument if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the thing that people forget is that it may not be broken for you, and it may not even be broken for me. But what is happening is the manageability of 9.6 is, even though it was a great release for its time, is completely different than the manageability of the upcoming 14. We
Right.
have
Yeah.
different tools, different methods, and asking someone, you can hire an experienced Postgres person who's only been working on Postgres since 10. They've never even touched 9.6. And then you ask them to essentially learn a new version of old tools to manage this system. It costs more to support it, which is why we do the surcharge.
Yeah, and I hear this all the time. We at AWS we do really encourage people to upgrade, and with Postgres, we know when it's going to be deprecated. Postgres 14 is being released this week. We already have the deprecation date, right? It's
That's
Postgres is
exactly
very
right.
good about that, so it should be no surprise to anybody. But the thing that people don't realize is databases, by their nature, change. I hear from customers all the time of saying we're not changing anything, but their data is. So they may run into a bug as their database gets a little bit bigger that they weren't expecting as you hit a certain threshold that wasn't accounted for before. Your databases are constantly changing with the data itself. So even though it may have been running great for 5 years, doesn't mean that it's going to still run tomorrow because it bumps into a bug that your database hit a different threshold that it wasn't hitting yesterday. So by their very nature, they just change. So you really need to upgrade and apply the minor versions and the major versions on a regular basis, and just build that into your normal cadence of maintenance on your databases and really your whole infrastructure stack of always applying the appropriate patches and doing upgrades, because by its nature they're not static things.
Well, yes. And would you say that a reasonable correlation would be, a lot of businesses, and this isn't necessarily true now because we have the cloud, but for a long time, people would not, enterprises wouldn't buy hardware; they would lease hardware, and they would lease it out over a 3 or 5 year term, and then rotate the hardware up, right? Well, when you rotate the hardware up, you automatically got a new version of the operating system, a new version of the libraries, and you had to deal with that. That's not any different than what we're talking about here. is that we have a known quantity of limited life that we have to manage. And it'd be one thing. I mean, first off, Postgres is very good about this. It'd be one thing if it was, 9 months or 2 years. We're talking about 5 years. And a responsible company will actually say to itself, okay, if we're around in 5 years, when I say if because you never know, but if we're around in 5 years, we understand that by year three, we are planning the upgrade so that we're ready to go with the latest, at a minimum, the latest back release by the middle of year four, right? That way,
Yep.
it's never a concern. It's just part of the growth plan of the company itself. Um, let's before we go on, because you and I have dealt with many, 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 many companies over the years, and we could go on and on about various weird things that companies do. But I want to go back to MariaDB or even MySQL and be a little bit more fair to them because I let my Postgres tusks kind of roar
Not
their
you.
heads on that. No, yeah, not me. What is something that, and I'll bring this back around when you tell me. What is something that PostgreSQL, whether technologically or community wise, could learn or should learn and take to heart from, say, MariaDB?
Well, the MariaDB from a community standpoint is run completely different than how Postgres is, right? It's you and I know the ins and outs of the .org community in Postgres and how that's done. MariaDB uses more modern tools for being able to encourage new development and bring in more people into the fold compared to Postgres using pretty old methods of really email patches and no bug trackers. Things like that is certainly something that Postgres can learn from the MariaDB community itself. From and from a technology standpoint, MariaDB is listening to its users and adding features to it that it's hearing directly from the users, not necessarily what the developers want to build. Right? It's a lot more interactive like that. MariaDB has things like Oracle compatibility and other storage engines like the S3 and other things that Postgres doesn't have or would even think of bringing.
Well, now, to be fair, I think that argument, there's two parts to that argument. The tooling is, I think, absolutely and 100% valid. Postgres is living in a different world. They're living in a very old school open source world, very academic, where email was the collaboration tool back in the early 90s, and even through, from the late 70s all the way up to the early 90s for doing this type of stuff. I mean, I was part of the argument to get PostgreSQL.org off of CVS, and that was an argument that it should have happened 5 years before we even had it. And the leaps and bounds that we have achieved in the community for the technology itself in consideration of that is pretty remarkable. But the listening to the users part, that's interesting to me because in Postgres, primarily, at least from as I recall, we're talking about, we have a lot of contributors, but they're contributors from companies. Now there are individual contributors. I don't want to take away from that, but a large amount of them are from Enterprise DB and now Enterprise DB Second Quadrant, because it used to be Enterprise DB Second Quadrant. They're from Percona, they're from Hygo, they're from VMware. So wouldn't the argument be that, in theory, that those companies are listening to the users and then working on patches based on that?
To some degree, but those companies have their own products, right? Of forks of Postgres that they're selling.
That's
So
true.
a lot of those things are in their enterprise versions or their commercial versions of Postgres and don't necessarily make it upstream. Some of the features do, but part of that comes back to the tooling there, the community. It's really hard for a DBA at a financial services company to communicate with any of the hackers in Postgres because they don't know they have to join this mailing list and talk with them compared to just finding it on GitHub and opening an issue.
or even GitLab. I mean, let's
Yeah,
be fair. If we went true to open source, GitHub is not it, right? It would be
yeah, right.
I'm not complaining about GitHub, just stating the obvious. It would be GitLab. But I would agree with you there. And the other thing that it strikes me that what you said about the commercial products and not being able to find where to go. The number of people that I know that run PostgreSQL, and I'm talking about normal PostgreSQL, not Aurora, not RDS, not Azure, none of those, that have no idea outside of, oh, there's a postgresql.org, that they never actually visit, is very large, right? They're on the Slack channel,
Hmm.
or they're on the subreddit, right? Or they're on the Discord server. But I mean, I was having this argument with Drupal, you know, 5, 7 years ago when they were trying to make their PostgreSQL support better. They asked me point blank, how do we communicate with the community? And I said, well, you use email. And they're like, no, we're not going to do that. They don't find it efficient. They don't find it productive. And, it's just not what they use.
Right. People will go to the postgresql.org website and get the download. They'll find some documentation there, but finding the actual community from there, it's difficult for users, and especially if you don't know where to look. And even then, it's a mechanism that I'm going to sign up for this mailing list. How many emails am I going to get on my corporate email address, like, that I have to
Oh,
start
yeah,
giving
no
them?
doubt. um, well, that, and it's also not the modern way to collaborate, right? I mean, it's one of the astounding things to me is that in order to actually collaborate, I do need to know where to go, which is fine, right? I need to, if I need to go to the Slack channel, for example, which I don't use Slack, so I don't go to the Slack channel. Um, but it should be the lowest barrier of entry possible within reason, right? If someone wants to ask a question, to be a truly friendly community, this is what I mean. You were there, and I think it was '08 in Maryland when we were talking about the days of cowboy open source are over, and that was 13 years ago.
Right.
And uh, it was all about first and foremost, it's the barrier of entry. Be nice, just be helpful and be nice. Now, don't get me wrong, PostgreSQL is not antagonistic or anything, but email as a collaboration medium is oddly, as simple as it is, not the simplest way or the nicest way to interface with a user.
No, and especially with some of the etiquettes on the Postgres list of people not knowing or expecting it, of how you do inlining with your responses and other things. And when corporate email, you're typically top post, and that's frowned upon, posting to the Postgres mailing list. So even when you get there, you get the response of don't top post. So it's a difficult thing for new users to come in and learn the ins and outs of the etiquette of the community, of really where to get started. And a lot of people may just have a simple one or two simple questions, and that's their interaction with the community. And it's a high bar to do that compared to the people who are there every day, who are contributing to the code, who are used to those things. That's completely different. But those new users, when they're going to the simple general list or other things, uh, you know, people are just there saying, "Hey, why does Postgres do this? Can somebody help me and point me in the right direction?" And it's not the easiest thing for people to get started to do that.
Well, it's also asynchronous, right? You don't know when someone's going to respond, and you don't necessarily know if someone's going to respond on the Discord server. I mean, but we have 2,400 people there at any given time, right? So you log in, you ask a question. If someone can answer, they're just going to answer it. Versus, one of the things I've noticed on especially the general list, is that a lot of the simple questions, or questions that are not even simple questions are a little bit outside the norm of what a general question would be, don't get answered.
Right.
And part of that, I think, is because the growth of Postgres is no longer hobbyists. We're all professionals trying to do a job. And so it can be a little bit frustrating, I think, for the Postgres community to be, and I'm not picking on Amazon at all, but for, when someone comes to the general community and they ask a question about RDS,
Right.
PostgreSQL.org should not be fielding those questions. And so what happens is that someone will say, well, you're going to have to ask Amazon. And some people will help to a degree because they use it or it's something that is universal between RDS and PostgreSQL. But they'll say, look, you're paying for RDS, go ask Amazon, which I think is a very reasonable response, but it's also not friendly, right? These people don't know the difference between RDS Postgres and PostgreSQL.org. They have no idea because PostgreSQL is just a common term at this point, right? It's used for everything Postgres.
Yeah, you see from all the different variations of Postgres. Postgres is becoming, like you said, the Linux of databases. But even more so, when you create new databases, people are doing it Postgres compatible, right? Like a Cockroach DB, right? So that you're bringing in those other communities there, and that the way people not getting responses around things like the generalist, that part of that's the success of Postgres. Of there's just so many more people using it now that the people can't monitor all those lists anymore the way that you and I used to back in the day, being able to read everything. It's just not possible anymore. There's so much activity across them. So part of it is just trying to find the new mechanisms in order to be able to do that. Some of that is things like the Discord server, the Slack channels, and other mechanisms to be able to help people. Even Twitter, right? Of being able to do that. But when you go through the community channels of the mailing list, that's still, I think, has to evolve a bit.
Yeah, and I mean they will. They always do. They just do it a little slower than what a lot of us would like. But I think one of the larger concerns in that realm, and then I think we're going to move on, is the tooling. Right? The more archaic the tooling becomes, the more not invented here, the more non-standard, the more you're going to have to pay people to contribute. It's just that simple. The simpler you make it to contribute, the more contributors you get. And that was the main draw of something like a GitHub, right? Because all of a sudden, even if you don't like Git, it's a certain way that someone does something. Like Linus doesn't like the way that GitHub does. I think it's pull request messages or something, but it's still better than the alternative. Let's move on here. So you are a big fan of open source and Postgres, obviously.
Yep.
What operating system's on your laptop?
Right now it's Windows because of all the corporate things that I need, but really am running Ubuntu on there. And that's my day-to-day environment, what's open, the windows that are open within it. But because of all the corporate applications I need to be able to connect to, it's either Windows or Mac. And Windows gave me a better Linux experience for my day-to-day development stuff.
Isn't that just a strange thing to say?
Yeah.
Windows. I was actually for Ronix, and for those who don't know, look it up. It's PHORONIX. Is doing some benchmarking on Windows systems for Linux. On Windows 11, which isn't quite out yet, and they're saying that performance-wise, it is comparable to just running Ubuntu. So what that means is, for all the geeks out there that run Windows for one reason and one reason only, that's games, you can now have Windows 11 and all of its interesting features. Let's say that. But you can also fire up all the stuff you really love using, like Ubuntu, Linux, things like that, and get comparable performance. That's I always like to think good things. I like to think good things and keep positive thoughts. But I came up in the day of the board when it was Microsoft and antitrust, and I know they're a different company now. We've worked with them; they're awesome. But you really have to wonder if part of their goal, their business plan, is to make Linux so homogenous that Linux doesn't exist. And what I mean by that is, how many people out there run an Android phone? Billions. But what they don't realize is Android is just a Linux distribution.
Yep.
So what happens when it's Windows 11 or 12 or 13, which is still, no matter how much we love to think that, this is the year of the Linux desktop, it's the predominant desktop platform. So the question is, outside of ideology, why would I run Linux when Linux runs just fine on Windows? And to further add evidence to that, Microsoft is solidly, squarely working on the same thing for Android apps.
Yeah, it was a learning curve to go back to Windows because I was running a Linux laptop for a decade or more. But when joining AWS, it was a lot simpler to be able to integrate in with the rest of the company using Windows. So it was a learning curve to go back and remembering everything. Wanted to go back and kind of remember the Windows 2000 things, which no longer exist. But the first thing I did was get the Ubuntu piece running there and build Postgres, and it just works. You could use apt and other things there, and it was just a good Linux environment that I didn't have to boot up a virtual machine. It was just there. And it was extremely productive to be able to get both environments on the same laptop without dual booting it or opening up virtual machines or containers or other things like that.
Okay, so I want to move on a little bit beyond the tech and talk a little bit more about culture. Something's kind of shifted in the past few years. For a long time in the open source free software community, it wasn't necessary. It leaned libertarian, and I don't like to use the term libertarian really because when the common person who just uses a computer for their job, they're not necessarily like you and I. Hear libertarian, you think of the crackpot that wears a noodle strainer on his head and is trying to run for mayor. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is an ideology of freedom, of individual pursuit, and of basically this idea of, if I'm not hurting someone, including myself, just leave me alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I choose to interact with society, great. If I don't, great. That type of thing. And the community, up until I would say about 2012, really leaned in that direction.
Right.
All the way to some people that are a little bit, they're well known, but you really wonder if they're well known for the right things, like an Eric Raymond. But even just commonly, because back then I was involved in software in the public interest, and outside of the Debian folks, a lot of people were very, very libertarian, very, hey, as long as they're not hurting us, why do we even care? But now there's a shift. And that shift is pushing, a lot of people like the term progressive. I don't consider it progressive. I actually call it regressive. But that shift away from freedom toward, I don't, I want, it's not even really equality, but you know what I'm saying? That equitable, that level equitable field. What do you think of that, and what do you think that shift is attributed to?
I think part of it has to do with the maturity of open source and how it's now becoming more of a business. Right? Back, 10, 15 years ago, we could make a living off of it doing consulting. But now there are billion-dollar open source companies where it's become more corporate. So there's more structure around things. So the people are seeing that as compared to years ago, where everybody was just trying to help one another and build a good project, not even a good product, and in there being able to make a living doing something they enjoy doing. Now it's gone into that next level of, now people are building companies off of this, having like livelihood of people in there are not necessarily part of the open source communities. Right? You start having marketing and sales and other aspects of business around that open source with people that are never interacting with those open source communities, which influences the way people are thinking and growing. And people didn't grow up with the the early days of open source when it really was a us versus commercial interest type of thing. We're going to do this in spite of that there's being a Microsoft or an Oracle or SAP or other things. I'm going to build my own. Now those companies are, some of them succeeded wildly and grown and built nice big business models off of those open source communities. So I think that's part of it, of some of the shift, is now that it's gone from not necessarily hobbyists, but the small businesses really running open
Academics,
source,
maybe.
Academics, yeah, compared to now being a lot more corporate. So it needs more structure. So and structure means rules, which is kind of anti, I guess, libertarian, I guess, in a lot of aspects. You can't, part of it is you have to structure an email this way, right? People used to be a little bit more forgiving about that compared to now because they have less time, right? Because they have other demands on their life now other than just doing Postgres or Linux or Apache for fun.
Okay, so that's kind of interesting, because I think that a lot of, just going back to PostgreSQL, there's a lot of core contributors that, or I should say major contributors, that have been doing this for as long as you and I have.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore that's the way it's done. But
yeah, there's a inertia in doing things like that. It's always been that way, right? This is, as we get older, we don't want to change, right? I noticed that in my own life I like doing the same thing every day. I have the same thing for breakfast every day. And if I don't have my same breakfast every day, I get a little cranky, right? So it's just the routine, that something you get used to. And some of the major contributors like you and I have done this for a really long time, and change is hard.
Well, it definitely is. I mean, I find that my interests have expanded. I mean, just to be perfectly honest with you, I don't care if I ever learn another database system. Postgres does what I need. I don't have that, late 20s, early 30s drive to know all the things in terms of technology, or at least of the technology that we're known for. For my shift was, over the summer, I became a carpenter. I didn't expect to become a carpenter. I had never had a specific desire to become a carpenter, but suddenly I'm a carpenter, and I know all these things that I didn't know before. And that's far more interesting than battling out an ideological problem amongst an open source community. But what I was really going after is there seems to be, you bring up the professional, or your people are making livelihoods, but it seems that our culture has become, as a whole, and now our world, the open source world, the technology world, is getting dragged into it, into a political process. And we don't need to get political about this. It's more that the shift is causing. It used to be that technology or technologists were a rare breed, right? Especially DBAs, right? Even today, DBAs are rare. But we were the people in the basements. Go talk to John in the closet. I don't know how it works. Jesse does. And there were only, when you talk about the complete job market, we were 1, 2, 3, 4% of the people that really knew how to do this stuff. But now what you have is I will say this, and after this podcast, you might smack me for it, but I can't help it. As much as I am a capitalist, and as much as capitalism has done wonderful things, and I believe fully and frankly and without any argument that open source would not be where it is today in terms of mass adoption without the capitalist. Mm-hmm. It would just be a hobby to this day if it wasn't that someone saw there was a way to feed people if they could monetize it. Okay. And anyone that argues with that does not understand basic economics. So there's I agree that that's a very good thing, but every good thing has a flip side. And you have to wonder if the capitalism and the greed of things is taking away from the actual innate or intrinsic good that's something that an open source can do.
Yeah, I think we see that with some of the companies changing their licenses away from open source licensing, right? As they were open source, and they still have open source versions, but they went and changed their licensing to non-open source compliant licensing, and some of that does change that that mechanism there of people contributing, and then they get nervous about contributing because what's going to happen to my code when I contribute it. So we are seeing that day to day inside the open source communities, with the companies around them, but even like you said, around society. You know, 10, 15 years ago, you didn't talk about politics nearly as much as we do now. It is in every aspect of society, no matter what side you're on. It's popping up. Part of that might be social media or other aspects, but you can't get away from that political view of, I disagree with you because you're the other side of the aisle than what I am, and I can't come to any sort of agreements. It used to be we might argue about politics over at the bar over a beer every now and then, but it wasn't that everything you look at is politics. And personally, that's what I'm seeing more and more. It's just even was driving down the highway this last weekend, and there's billboards, you know, political billboards that have nothing to do with any election that's coming up or anything, just because somebody wanted to spend money on a political billboard. Right? It's just everywhere, in every aspect of things, right down to the pandemic being political where it shouldn't be, and how we're reacting to it. But it's just ingrained in society at this point. You know, and it's filtering into open source too. Of you disagree with me, so I have to always be wrong. Is kind of the way society is moving right now, unfortunately.
Well, and I do attribute it a lot to, honestly, and this might get me into a little bit of trouble. I don't care what side you're on, whether you're left, right, what I really don't care. What I really care about is, can I have a conversation with you without you screaming and yelling? And if you cannot articulate your position and you cannot cite your sources for that position, then really you're just part of the screaming mob. And the screaming mob does not represent a progressive society. A progressive society is one where the people take care of each other, not the government. Where the people listen and grow together, not the government being authoritarian over it and forcing the issue. And that's particularly dangerous with American politics, because our politics can literally swing the entire spectrum, right? The entire compass in 4 years. We can go from eloquence and intelligence, if a bit aloof, and if not nearly as good as he thought he was, to a screaming maniac who was a reality TV star, right? Now, that doesn't mean, and the funny thing about that screaming maniac is that the people that actually did the research found that the policies, not what he said, right? Not what he said, but his actual policies of what was passed and signed into law, by far the majority of them were bipartisan. But instead of that being brought to light, it was the public fight. And now, unfortunately, now the new leader who, is suffering from the blowback of that, and all he's trying to do is be a statesman, whether you agree with him or not. And that's the point that I'm actually making, is that we just got to be able to have a conversation, and we got to be able to learn from each other. And if you can't do that, it's going to be a bad thing. But there is one thing I wanted to wrap this up with. You opened the door to it, and that was people changing their licenses. Mm-hmm. Now, let's be honest. Although there are a few people that have changed their licenses and are trying to create this quote unquote ethical source movement, which is a very immature way to approach open source. Don't get me wrong. If that's what you want to do, great, go for it. Have at it. But don't call it open source because that's not what it is. Um, a lot of those license changes were due to Amazon. Now, for those that don't know, this is what happened. Amazon discovered that open source was fantastic. Amazon decided to start selling services, in this case, managed services, on certain open source products. Now, here's the key. The word is product. So you take a company who is trying to make their livelihood off of open source without a viable model around open source, and another company legitimately, willingly does it better, and now you're upset with them. But all they did was exactly what open source is for. So it surprises me that there was so much blowback, because anyone who knows what open source actually is would have actually celebrated Amazon taking this and making this software more obtainable to people. That's the whole point of open source. Open source and free software isn't about money. That's the side effect, right? Open source and free software is about making technology available to any user free of charge, right? And what you did was create a service around that, right? So
Right.
what are your thoughts on the complaints there?
Um, so yeah, AWS as a company has some of their own services that are built like a DynamoDB, but a large number of them are just managing open source software. EC2, for instance, is managed Linux. Can be managed
Right.
Windows too, but it's managed Linux for you. So this way you get a Linux, an SSH prompt, and away you go. You can do what you want. RDS Postgres is managed Postgres, and AWS has a big influence over the enterprise usage of open source, because things are difficult in the open source world to use. Think about Postgres, setting that up with high availability and other things. It's like it requires somebody like command prompt to go and set that up for production stuff right. If you want to run an enterprise workload on there, to make sure you did it, because it requires some experience compared to the commercial databases where you click through the installer and you go. It's from an open source standpoint, it's a lot more fun writing new index type than it is to write an installer in order to be
Right.
able to set those things up. But AWS managed Postgres to make those sort of things easier. And because of that, it opened up Postgres to a whole new world of users who normally wouldn't use Postgres because they had to go download it and set it up. And even just the configuration of what should I set the things in the PostgreSQL.conf file, what should it be? They Google around and set some things and hope they got it right compared to managing it. Right? So it did be able to help bring open source into that next tier of people who can't go as deep as like yourself and be able to understand things and how to set things up as correctly, and just be able to use it. Because I'm a JavaScript developer, I need a database, I don't know how to set it up. Here, just click, run this API or go through the console and give me a Postgres database. And if I need it for production, I'll have it set up with multi-AZ for high availability and go. So it made those sort of things simple that are really hard to do with the just getting the stuff from PostgreSQL.org. And AWS has done that with other open source projects as well, of making it more accessible to the users who aren't as deep into DevOps and other things, who are more web developers or more front end developers.
Well, and on that, I mean, AWS does contribute back to many of the communities,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Right, and whether it be the various different Apache projects, Linux itself, or Postgres. One of the things that I'm trying to work on with RDS Postgres and Aurora Postgres is helping the internal AWS teams navigate some of those Postgres community nuances in order to be able to contribute some of that stuff back. Right? It's hard to get it's hard to explain to a lifetime enterprise developer the right way to submit a patch back to community Postgres and the right process there. It takes a little while in order to be able to do that, but we're learning as a team in order to be able to do that and give back that back. So you frequently give back bug fixes and other things, but even new new features. And then going on in the future, we'll see other things like the Babelfish project and other things going to be open sourced, and other new things being open sourced more and more back to the Postgres community and the open source community.
All right. Well, hey, Jimmy, you and I have known each other a long time, and we've kind of grown up and out of from the core open source stuff into the professional services and products, and we have evolved into our professional roles. As you mentioned in the beginning, we are co-chairs of Postgres Conference and Postgres World, which is the largest Postgres conference series in the world. And it is nonprofit, and we do it for people Postgres data. We do it to help people with Postgres and data. We want people to succeed with this software and grow this community. And I just wanted to take the time to thank you again. And I hope to see you on the East Coast.
Sure. JD, hopefully you have a great trip across the country, and I can't wait to see you out here on the East Coast when you get here in your school bus.